This investigation is sponsored by Holzkern. Hey fellow seekers, I'm Mr. Mythos, and we're back with another episode of Inner Earth Conspiracy Theories. In the United States, 1909, an Arizona newspaper published a front-page report of an incredibly bizarre discovery made during an early Grand Canyon expedition. This report describes something that should have been historically impossible in America. That deep in the depths of a remote Grand Canyon cave lay hidden a vast, abandoned, ancient Egyptian city. Conspiracy theorists believe that after this report was published, the government orchestrated a massive cover-up to stop this discovery from breaking the established narrative of history. But according to the Native American tribes who've lived in and around the canyon for thousands of years, an ancient subterranean civilization beneath the Grand Canyon is in fact a historical reality. Today, we'll explore this lost excavation, its cast of characters, and the relevant events surrounding it. We'll weave through the facts, rumors, dangerous accusations, and lingering questions that have made this conspiracy theory particularly infamous. And at the end, I'll even reveal some new information I dug up myself. But before we dive into Inner Earth, for the first time in Mr. Mythos history, and thanks to today's incredible sponsor, Holzkern, I'd like you to meet my wife, Mrs. Mythos. She's been my best friend for over a decade, and 3 years ago in February, we got married, one of the most important moments of my life. I've been meaning to get her something very special for this Valentine's Day, so I was deep into the hunt. That was until Holzkern reached out and I opened their website, and I saw the most beautiful watch made out of olive wood and mother of pearl. To me, it really captured the unique and timeless quality of nature, which is a great way to describe the love I have for her. But I was surprised to find that I really like their men's watches too. So we each decided to pick a few gifts for the other, and I think we're both very happy. It's hard not to appreciate the intention Holzkern puts into each piece, where it's deeper than just beauty because of the very essence it's made of. The natural materials remind us that the bonds we have with our partner are timeless and true, and a very precious gift. For a very special Valentine's Day, Holzkern is offering 15% off their entire catalog, plus a free wooden postcard of your choice. Simply click my link in the description or use my promo code MYTHOS15. Thanks again to Holzkern. I just checked my watch and it's now time for us to return to Inner Earth. The Grand Canyon likely holds the oldest exposed rock on Earth. Its towering walls are nearly a mile high and some 2 billion years old, cut by the ancient waters of the Colorado River that today still runs between them. Despite being one of the most traveled destinations in the world, the Grand Canyon is absolutely shrouded in mystery. Arguably, the canyon's biggest unknowns are the holes that puncture the cliff face, caves whose secrets sit in perpetual darkness. The U.S. National Park Service states that there are over 1,000 known caves in the canyon. However, only 335 have been officially recorded, and far fewer have actually been mapped. They classify all enclosed underground structures as caves, by the way, whether they're natural or man-made like tunnels and mines. And this is for the purpose of making it simple to keep people out of all of them, because exploring any part of the Grand Canyon's underworld has been illegal for a very long time. The singular exception is a guided tour of the Cave of the Domes, the only canyon cave open to the public. Obviously, the canyon's caves are fragile and irreplaceable, so they need to be protected. They contain prehistoric artifacts, unique mineral formations, and fossils of rare extinct species. So there's a legitimate reason to keep people out. The problem is that a good reason isn't enough to get you in. It's common for even respected, experienced scientific professionals to be rejected because the real qualifications are unclear. Getting cave clearance in the Grand Canyon appears to be far more difficult than any other U.S. national park, for no apparent reason. That said, the government's first major effort to keep people out and away from the canyon's caves dates back to the year 1908. And 1908 happens to be when this abandoned underground city was supposedly discovered, during an exploratory voyage carried out by the adventurer and archaeologist G.E. Kincaid. And this is where our story begins. G.E. Kincaid was selected by his employer, the Smithsonian Institution, having proven his worth and ability over his 30 years of dedicated service to them. The goal of his mission was to document several unexplored areas of the western United States. The plan was for Kincaid to travel alone on a wooden boat, beginning his trip in Green River, Wyoming, then entering the Colorado River through Utah's canyonlands, and riding the current until he reached his final destination, Yuma, Arizona. This route, of course, would traverse the entire Grand Canyon. In 1908, there were no dams or other man-made structures to tame the fury of these wild waters. G. Kincaid was truly at the mercy of nature, with no guide or company. Moreover, he'd be only the second person in recorded history to make this voyage, following the great American explorer John Wesley Powell, who braved these unknown lands in 1869 with a crew of 10 men, only 7 of whom survived it. So the odds weren't exactly in Kincaid's favor. But at the end of the journey, as expected from the Smithsonian's carefully chosen candidate, Kincaid did achieve his goal, with his only loss being a single oar. On March 12, 1909, the Arizona Gazette published an article titled "G.E. Kincaid Reaches Yuma." They announced the adventurer's incredible accomplishment, surviving this 1,000-mile journey, mapping new routes, terrains, and landmarks, and even taking over 700 photographs along the way. While they celebrated these successes, the article's conclusion indicated that Kincaid had found something. Quote, "Some interesting archaeological discoveries were unearthed, and altogether the trip was of such interest that he will repeat it next winter in the company of friends." End quote. This vague hint reveals almost nothing, because the journalist was yet unaware of any details. That was until 24 days later. On April 5, 1909, the Arizona Gazette published a follow-up that would become the centerpiece of this entire mystery. The article titled "Explorations in Grand Canyon." As a full-length journalistic piece with front-page coverage, it's dramatically different from the first, but for good reason. Because Kincaid's discovery wasn't just groundbreaking, it was utterly shocking. Quote, "What is now regarded by scientists as not only the oldest archaeological discovery in the United States, but one of the most valuable in the world, was brought to the city yesterday by G.E. Kincaid, the explorer who found the great underground citadel of the Grand Canyon during a trip from Green River to Yuma several months ago. The archaeologists of the Smithsonian have made discoveries that almost conclusively prove that the race which inhabited this mysterious cavern was of Oriental origin, possibly from Egypt, tracing back to the pharaoh Ramses." End quote. About 2/3 of the article are G.E. Kincaid's own words, the statement he made for the Gazette's reporters. And he begins with a frank warning that I'd also like to adopt as my own disclaimer for all you watching. Do not go out and search for this cave. I'm serious. Kincaid gives these 2 reasons. Quote, "First, I would impress that this cavern is nearly inaccessible. The entrance is 1,486 feet down the sheer canyon wall. Second, it is located on government land and no visitor will be allowed there under penalty of trespass." End quote. With that, the archaeologist goes on to describe exactly where he found it. Kincaid states that it was along the course of the Colorado River, approximately 42 miles from a location he refers to as the El Tovar Crystal Canyon. At the time, there were very few designated names for places in the Grand Canyon. In fact, before 1908, the Grand Canyon wasn't even officially called Grand. So, to pinpoint this El Tovar Crystal Canyon, we have to speculate why Kincaid called it that name in the first place. Historically, the name El Tovar comes from the Spanish explorer Pedro de Tovar. In the 16th century, Tovar led a troop of conquistadors on a large-scale expedition through the southwest region of North America, with the goal to locate the legendary 7 cities of Cibola and conquer them. In Aztec mythology, Cibola is spoken of as 7 ancient hidden utopias with such enormous wealth that all their monuments and temples are forged from solid gold. While Pedro de Tovar failed to find even a single city of Cibola, he did become the first European to learn of the existence of the Grand Canyon from the native people, though he'd never actually see it. Around 4 centuries later, in 1905, a luxury resort opened at the Grand Canyon's south rim. Named in honor of Pedro de Tovar's unseen discovery, El Tovar Hotel was built literally 20 feet from the cliff edge to ensure its guests an incredible view of the canyon. It overlooks many sites, the most relevant being Crystal Creek. It seems possible that Kincaid named El Tovar Crystal Canyon using these 2 reference points, but no one can say for sure. In his voyage that day, G.E. Kincaid was enjoying the views as his wooden boat slowly cruised along the river. Looking up at the canyon wall, his eyes caught a glimpse of some strange red markings stained into a sedimentary shelf some 2,000 feet above. These colorations were so striking that he felt compelled to stop and investigate. With no small amount of bravery and cardio, he hiked, climbed, and jumped his way up to the cliffside shelf. Once he reached it, he was surprised to discover the mouth of a cave. From below, the shelf hid this cave so well that it was impossible to see from any angle. Looking closer, Kincaid noticed a long path of carefully carved steps leading to the cave entrance, which made him think there was likely something of value inside. So he jumped to the closest step, followed the path up, unharnessed his pistol, and proceeded into the dark void. There he would discover that his hunch was correct. Quote, "I went back several hundred feet along the main passage till I came to the crypt in which I discovered the mummies. One of these I stood up and photographed by flashlight. I gathered a number of relics. I shipped them to Washington with details of the discovery. Following this, explorations were undertaken." End quote. When Kincaid mentioned Washington, we can safely say that he sent the relics to his employer, the Smithsonian Institution, whose headquarters are in Washington, D.C. At this point, our second main character enters the picture, a professor by the name of S.A. Jordan, who the Smithsonian assigned as the director of the exploration and excavation efforts that followed Kincaid's discovery. The Arizona Gazette reporter states, quote, "Under the direction of Professor S.A. Jordan, the Smithsonian Institute is now prosecuting the most thorough explorations. Nearly a mile underground, about 1,480 feet below the surface, the long main passage has been delved into to find another mammoth chamber from which radiates scores of passageways, like the spokes of a wheel. Several hundred rooms have been discovered." End quote. One of the most dedicated modern researchers of this mystery, Jack Andrews, used these descriptions to create an accurate diagram of the cave's layout. This was over 20 years ago, and unfortunately the original file seems to be lost, so the quality isn't great, but it still helps to visualize. So it's an enormous place, but beyond the structure itself, what exactly did they find? Kincaid describes some truly bizarre discoveries, starting with the large statue sitting at the very center of this inner earth complex. And in case you're expecting something Egyptian, well, this statue is definitely not from Egypt. Quote, 100 feet from the entrance is the idol, or image of the people's god, sitting cross-legged with a lotus flower or lily in each hand. The cast of the face is oriental. The idol almost resembles Buddha. It is possible that this worship most resembles the ancient people of Tibet. Surrounding this idol are smaller idols, some very beautiful in form, others crooked-necked and distorted shapes. There are 2 large cactuses with protruding arms, one on each side of the throne on which the god squats. All of this is carved out of hard rock resembling marble. End quote. Cactus imagery combined with anything from the cold mountainous region of Tibet is strange, to say the least. But Tibet is highly relevant here. The Tibetan Buddhists and their ancient predecessors held one of the strongest and most explicit beliefs in an advanced inner earth civilization, which they called Shambhala. Ancient Buddhist and Hindu scriptures describe Shambhala as an underground city located somewhere in the Himalayan mountains, powered by magical technology and populated by a race of demigods who purposefully conceal their existence from the surface world. However, prophecies state that the people of Shambhala will one day re-emerge to usher in a new era. So, with a Buddha-like statue as the centerpiece of this entire complex, you might be wondering, Mr. Mythos, where's the Egyptian connection here? Well, about that, it's a bit complicated. It's true that ancient Egypt, like Tibet, embraced some of the strongest and most richly detailed inner earth traditions we know of. Historical records that date back thousands of years speak of a vast subterranean network of hundreds of chambers beneath the Giza Plateau, and the ancient Egyptians believed that one of these chambers hid the entrance to an underworld governed by Osiris, the god of death. Many Egyptian texts, such as the Book of the Dead and the Book of the Two Ways, describe the realm of Osiris as a real accessible place. And interestingly, modern Egyptologists argue that Osiris himself was a real living ruler some 7,000 years ago. Ancient Egypt certainly held inner earth beliefs, but the Egyptian link to the Grand Canyon mystery is complicated for a different reason. This is because G.E. Kincaid never actually described anything as Egyptian in his statements. He never hinted at it either. The only one to connect this underground complex to Egypt was the Arizona Gazette reporter, whose fiery fingers couldn't help but add extra spice to an already insane discovery. Much of the Western world at this time, and especially the United States, was swept up by Egyptomania. Anything related to ancient Egypt would have people foaming at the mouth and sweating with fascination. So, as a general strategy, mentioning Egypt usually sold more papers, and this reporter took every opportunity possible, and more. All that said, G.E. Kincaid does reveal two discoveries that naturally conjure strong images of Egypt. The first was, quote, "On the urns or walls over doorways and tablets of stone are the mysterious hieroglyphs, the key to which the Smithsonian Institute hopes yet to discover," end quote. As the archaeologists marveled at these undeciphered writings, they led him into a huge room where a far more disturbing scene would capture his attention. Quote, "The tomb or crypt is one of the largest of the chambers. On these walls are tiers of mummies, each one occupying a separate cut shelf. At the head of each is a small bench on which is found copper urns and pieces of broken swords. The urns are finer in design, showing a later stage of civilization. It is worthy of note that all the mummies examined so far have proved to be male, with no children or females being buried here." End quote. With multiple levels of mummified bodies surrounding the observer from all sides and heights, is pretty unnerving. And whoever these people were, they were apparently advanced enough to have discovered copper metallurgy and forged swords, two things unheard of in the Americas prior to the arrival of Europeans in the 15th century. But perhaps the most telling detail in this tomb was that the mummies were all grown men, with no remains of women or children. This indicates that this inner earth complex was almost definitely not a city, despite having several hundred rooms. However, it was also far too massive to have strictly been a burial site. Kincaid asserted, quote, "Upwards of 50,000 people could have lived in the caverns comfortably," end quote. No evidence has ever been found of an ancient population that size in the Grand Canyon, at least on the surface. But what if these people came from inner Earth? At the end of the article, the Gazette reporter suggests this possibility, and specifically they tie it to the creation myth of the Hopi Native Americans, which tribe elders still teach to this day, not as mythology, but as history. Since this story has been passed on orally, it has many versions with varying details. I'll try to point out the main differences and avoid mixing too many elements together. But honestly, the Hopi creation myth is definitely one of my favorites, and I'm excited to tell it. So, without further ado, for generations, a peculiar history has been passed down through the Hopi that their ancient ancestors once lived in a vast underground realm somewhere beneath the Grand Canyon. In Inner Earth, times weren't always sunny, pun intended, and the Hopi ending up on the Earth's outer surface was definitely not in the original plan. It's believed that the sun spirit Tawa formed a total of 4 different worlds on Earth. However, each world was imperfect in ways that made the lives of the people rather miserable. So Tawa set out to fix things the best way he could. The people of the first world were insect-like beings who lived deep underground, and they hated it. Tawa saw this and sent a demigod, who the Hopi call Spider Grandmother, to the first world. Spider Grandmother rallied up all the insectoids who would listen and led them through a long cave system, all the way to Tawa's freshly created second world, another underground realm. During this journey, Tawa destroyed the first world with fire, and the surviving insectoids who followed Spider Grandmother were transformed into beings resembling wolves and bears. Unfortunately, these beast people ended up being just as miserable in the second world. So Tawa began working on a third Inner Earth world, while Spider Grandmother rallied up all the beast people who still trusted her and guided them back into the cave system, after which Tawa destroyed the second world with a massive ice age. By the time the survivors reached the third world, they had transformed into humans, and for the most part, they were happy. The ancestors of the Hopi would remain in this new Inner Earth realm for a very long and prosperous time. They formed a civilization of diverse thoughts, ideas, and values, and while this social freedom allowed them to thrive in many ways, unfortunately it eventually led to acts of evil, and many of the Inner Earth people ended up embracing this way of life. Good and evil don't mix, so the third world gradually divided into 2 factions on the verge of war. Spider Grandmother feared what might happen if the good people remained, so she again rallied all who would listen and convinced them to leave the third world and never return. It was at this time that Tawa created the fourth world, and this world was on the Earth's surface. However, the realm of Inner Earth was totally enclosed, with no exit. So, Spider Grandmother unleashed a powerful magic that caused a massive bamboo stalk to grow and grow until it broke through the surface crust. By the way, if you're like me and didn't know that bamboo grew natively in the Americas, well, it actually does. So, Spider Grandmother and her people gripped tightly to this bamboo stalk and climbed to the top, and one after another, they emerged on the surface of the Grand Canyon. This was the fourth world, where they'd forge a new civilization. Here is where the versions primarily differ. One version of the story tells that the Hopi's evil brothers and sisters were locked in their underground realm, where they remain to this day. In other accounts, Tawa destroyed the third world with a great flood, which curiously aligns with the belief shared across the world that a massive flood once destroyed all of civilization. Either way, the fourth world is still around, thankfully, though some days we seem to be pushing our luck. Returning to Kincaid's Cave, if we were to assume that the people who built and used this place could have been the same spoken of by the Hopi, the good people who escaped from Inner Earth, what if this was the place? Is it possible that somewhere in this vast complex is the hole ripped open by the bamboo stalk, the exit of the Hopi ancestors, and perhaps our entrance to the Inner Earth realm? While G. Kincaid never reported a hole or some sort of portal, he does describe one specific chamber that they were forced to turn away from and leave unexplored. Quote, "There is one chamber of the passageway to which is not ventilated, and when we approached it, a deadly snaky smell struck us. The gloom is like a weight on one's shoulders, and our flashlights and candles only make the darkness blacker. Until stronger lights are available, we will not know what the chamber contains. It may contain a deadly gas or chemicals used by the ancients." End quote. The extraordinary findings in this cave, stated by G.E. Kincaid in a matter-of-fact way, would have been of unthinkable value to our understanding of our history. We're talking about an impossible mashup of Native American, Tibetan, and some unknown Egyptian reminiscent culture that once lived in ancient North America. A discovery of this magnitude would not go unnoticed. Even the Arizona Gazette's article seemed to hint at more follow-ups to come. However, this was it. The Gazette would never publish anything more about Kincaid, this cave, or the artifacts. Over 110 years have passed since the article, and there's never been an update from any news outlet ever again. This was the story's quiet death, and it would be forgotten for nearly a century. But when it returned to the light, largely thanks to the internet, it came with massive implications. Could a vast hidden tunnel network with entry points beneath the Grand Canyon and other locations across the world explain the appearance of artifacts from the wrong hemisphere? If so, how did these mysterious mixed culture people get to the Grand Canyon? And is it possible that we're dealing with one of the most successful cover-ups in American history? If we're looking for evidence, the number one suspect to turn our attention to is the Smithsonian Institution, who, according to the article, employed G.E. Kincaid and also carried out the subsequent excavation. Created by the US government in 1846, today the Smithsonian Institution is the largest research, education, and museum complex in the world. But despite holding over 154 million artifacts, artworks, and specimens, less than 2% are displayed to the public, with the rest of its inventory locked behind closed doors. The Smithsonian has a reputation for collecting artifacts that never again see the light of day. This is why many people call it the nation's attic. If the artifacts described by Kincaid were real and still exist, the nation's attic is probably where they are, covered in a thick blanket of dust and stowed away in a warehouse corner where employees would be none the wiser of these lost anomalies. But that's not to say they don't maintain extremely careful records. The Smithsonian is a serious scholarly institution. And for this reason, there was around a 2-decade period during which hundreds of independent researchers politely pestered them about the Grand Canyon mystery, hoping to spark some internal investigation, or at least a direct answer. This would become a reality in the year 2000, when the Smithsonian finally released a public statement. Quote, "The Smithsonian Institution has received many questions about an article in the April 5, 1909 Phoenix Gazette about G.E. Kincaid and his discovery of a great underground citadel in the Grand Canyon, hewn by an ancient race of Oriental origin, possibly from Egypt. The Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology has searched its files without finding any mention of a Professor Jordan, Kincaid, or a lost Egyptian civilization in Arizona." End quote. Whether guilty of conspiracy or innocent, in either case a flat-out denial should be completely expected. But just because they say it didn't happen doesn't necessarily mean that's the case, even if the conspiracy argument is unlikely. What's a big red flag, though, is that the Smithsonian referred to the Arizona Gazette by the wrong name. They called it the Phoenix Gazette. For a research institution, that's an embarrassing mistake. It suggests that not much effort was put into their internal investigation. However, the Smithsonian never corrected or even acknowledged it, and it's been well over 2 decades since. However, at least one part of their statement is correct. No verifiable trace of G.E. Kincaid and Professor S.A. Jordan have ever been found. People don't just disappear off the face of the earth. Or do they? Depending on how we choose to look at this, Kincaid and Jordan's apparent non-existence may either serve as this conspiracy theory's nail in the coffin, or a warning that cover-ups like this can, and sometimes do, go to extreme and disturbing lengths to bury the truth. We'll be investigating the evidence for Kincaid and Jordan in a bit, but not to get ahead of ourselves, there's still the issue of the missing artifacts, and the fact that over the Smithsonian's nearly 2 centuries of existence, the institution has been accused multiple times of destroying artifacts and covering it up. Important, well-documented artifacts have disappeared with them before, and the most famous example of this was also taken from a cave. This was Crump Burial Cave, located in Blount County, Alabama. In the summer of 1840, a man named James Newman and his friends were out hunting on land owned by the local Reverend William Crump. While looking at some limestone cliffs, Newman noticed a hole in one of them, barely large enough for a grown man to crawl in, and he suggested to his friends that they explore it. Newman went in first, slowly pulling himself through the hole, and after crawling just a short distance from the cliffside opening, the hole's tight walls opened up into a much larger room, which he could only feel as it was pitch black. Excited, he squirmed his way into the chamber where he could finally stand upright, and after lighting his torch, James Newman made a truly uncanny discovery. The official 1892 U.S. Geological Survey report described what he found as, quote, 8 or 10 wooden coffins of black and white walnut, about 7.5 feet long, hollowed out by fire. This method of coffin burial was unusual, if not unknown, in the United States, end quote. Ancient Native American coffins have never been seen before or after this discovery. Once the U.S. Geological Survey was complete, these coffins were transported directly to the Smithsonian Institution to be restored and eventually displayed. However, as far as anyone can tell, that's the last time they were ever seen. In 1950, a researcher named Frederick Pohl wrote a letter to the Smithsonian asking about these coffins, and he received a reply from F.M. Setzler, the head curator of the Department of Anthropology, who told him, quote, "We have not been able to find the specimens in our collections, though records show that they were received." End quote. Whatever these coffins meant to the Smithsonian, and what they may have revealed about the native people or something else entirely, we'll likely never know. Returning to the Grand Canyon mystery, if finding the artifacts themselves is a lost cause, then what other evidence should we search for? The Gazette articles mentioned that Kincaid carried high-end photography equipment, and that he took more than 700 photos, including photos of the mummies and other artifacts, which he then sent to the Smithsonian. Of course, none of these images have ever been found. They could have been destroyed as part of a cover-up, but just as easily, they may have never existed at all. And on that note, there's a possibility we can't ignore. What if the Arizona Gazette made up the whole story? The second article, Explorations in Grand Canyon, was published on April 5th. That's pretty close to April 1st, which is April Fool's Day. That said, who makes an April Fool's joke on April 5th? Moreover, the Arizona Gazette doesn't have a history of jokes or hoaxes on April Fools. And they definitely weren't known to publish completely fake stories. This was a relatively well-known and respected newspaper. But it's true that most news publications at that time sensationalized stories to sell more papers. And at the very least, there's pretty clear evidence of sensationalism here. As we know, the reporter spun Kincaid's words to make it seem like there was some sort of Egyptian connection to spice things up. In comparison, Kincaid's own account is scientific, and his speculations are far more reserved. When you read the article carefully, it becomes clear that Kincaid and the reporter are two people of different educations, perspectives, and motives, and this seems to suggest that the article is at least partially authentic. That is, G.E. Kincaid does come off as an actual professional in his field, and sounds very much like a real person. But if he was, why can't any trace of this man be found? No one has ever presented compelling evidence that G.E. Kincaid and his expedition, nor Professor S.A. Jordan and his excavation, ever existed, let alone the cave itself. But over the decades, independent researchers have dug up a few odd leads that might be worth some consideration. We'll begin by covering any possible trace of these two men, starting with Professor S.A. Jordan. Researchers of this mystery actually managed to dig up a real archaeologist by the name of S.A. Jordan, who was active in the same time period. However, there's a problem. This S.A. Jordan lived and worked on a completely different continent, as this archaeologist was European. Keep in mind that the first commercial flight was 5 years after these supposed events in 1908, so it's unlikely that he traveled all the way across the Atlantic by boat to perform work in America. But it's not impossible. The Gazette article never actually said that S.A. Jordan was an employee of the Smithsonian. He only supervised the explorations. So, in theory, he could have been a European specifically contracted for the job. Unfortunately, things only get hazier when it comes to G.E. Kincaid. Besides the 2 Arizona Gazette articles, there are no known references to G.E. Kincaid as an archaeologist or any other related profession. So, what can we make of this? Well, it's possible that the Arizona Gazette could have gotten his name wrong. A simple spelling mistake can break a lead and make it seem like whoever or whatever it is doesn't exist. There's reason to believe in this possibility. In the first article, G.E. Kincaid reaches Yuma. The Cade in Kincaid is spelled with a C. And in the second article, Explorations in Grand Canyon, Kincaid's K is spelled with a K. Now, if you're wondering whether this typo discredits the entire conspiracy theory, the answer is no. Typos were extremely common in newspapers back then. There was no spell check back in 1909. In fact, the Gazette article also mistakenly referred to the Smithsonian Institution as the Smithsonian Institute. And 9 decades later, the Smithsonian called the Arizona Gazette the Phoenix Gazette, showing us that these mistakes happen and it can really confuse things. We're not finished here though, because there may be a reference to both Kincaid and Jordan as a pair. And in terms of our most promising lead, this could very well be it, or at the very least a striking coincidence. In the September 22, 1908 issue of the Lewiston Evening Teller, which is a newspaper out of Idaho, there's a small report about something called the Stites Excursion Project that lists several participants, and 2 names, which happen to be right next to each other, are J.E. Kincaid and W.J. Jordan. First off, it's clear that the initials for both men don't match. J.E. Kincaid should be G.E. Kincaid, and W.J. Jordan should be S.A. Jordan. But the Lewiston Evening Teller is based in Lewiston, Idaho, which is exactly where the Arizona Gazette's first article says Kincaid is from. In 1909, Lewiston was a small town of anywhere between 1,000 to 5,000 people. It's hard to tell you how many Kincaids and Jordans existed in 1909, but Kincaid was and still is a rare last name in the US. There is room for coincidence, but this detail led me on the path to dig deeper. I wanted to know who these 2 Lewiston men were. I began by searching a newspaper clippings database for all mentions of J.E. Kincaid in the Lewiston Evening Teller in that same year, 1908. And surprisingly, this man was featured quite prominently. But he's definitely not an archaeologist who works for the Smithsonian. J.E. Kincaid either owns or was a spokesperson for a local business by the name of R.C. Beach Company. From what I could gather, R.C. Beach Company seems to have been a small store that was pretty popular with the locals, especially during their annual eruption sale, as they called it. Admittedly, despite all the clippings on R.C. Beach Company, I have no idea what they actually sold. In their own ad, they write, quote, "We have told you what awaits you here. We have what we have advertised." End quote. Now, I'm no marketing expert, but I think an ad is supposed to tell what they advertise. Back to the mystery though, I looked up W.J. Jordan and quickly found that he was a general agent of the Northern Pacific Company, which seems to be a fruit seller and the owner of several apple orchards in Lewiston. Again, no connection to archaeology whatsoever. In name and profession, neither of these men are the same spoken of by the Arizona Gazette. Nevertheless, this is definite proof that both a Kincaid and Jordan family existed in Lewiston, and because they were both key members of the Stites Excursion Project, clearly the 2 knew each other. So that leads into an even wilder theory, and we'd have to be crazy to believe this. But what if these men were G.E. Kincaid and S.A. Jordan's fathers? If their fathers were associates, and the two sons both shared a similar passion for archaeology, and later in life, Kincaid Jr. made the find of a lifetime, who else would he recommend to the Smithsonian to supervise the excavation than his small-town friend, Professor Jordan? Finally, what was this Stites excursion project? Excursion is another word for a journey or expedition, and it occurred the very same year as Kincaid's journey. I'll tell you, these inner Earth conspiracy theories are a real trip. Alright, let's say that G.E. Kincaid actually existed and made the report to the sensational but innocent Arizona Gazette. There is one final lingering question. Why should we trust Kincaid? Note that Professor S.A. Jordan was never actually interviewed by the Gazette. The reporter from the Gazette also never visited the cave or saw any of the findings. All the information was from the mouth of Kincaid, with nothing to back it up. None of Kincaid's claims can be proven, but they shouldn't be overlooked either. Because out of all these specifics Kincaid provided, there is one tiny detail that might suggest that his discovery was authentic. He states, quote, "The mummies are covered with clay," end quote. Covering mummies in clay is a real and effective 7,000-year-old mummification technique known to exist in the Americas. However, the first mummies discovered using this technique, the Chinchorro mummies of South America, weren't discovered until 1917. This detail would have been impossible to know, unless it was, again, a very lucky coincidence, or if Kincaid actually saw it. So, if his findings were genuine, we gotta bring this back to Inner Earth. Might Kincaid's cave be evidence of the third world spoken of in the Hopi creation myth? We know that the Hopi have a very close connection with Inner Earth, both spiritual and historical. Beyond their creation myth, the Hopi dug a number of ancient man-made tunnels all throughout the Grand Canyon. One, for example, is the Hopi Salt Mine, which is completely restricted just like the park's other caves, and thus very few pictures of it exist. This deep tunnel system is suspected to have never actually been a mine at all, despite its mineral richness, but instead used solely for a specific initiation ceremony. It's believed this ceremony occurred when a Hopi boy came of age, and he would be made to enter and travel through the darkness of the mine, collect a special sacred salt from its deepest depths, and finally emerge from the tunnels as a grown man. Clearly, this journey is metaphorically related to the idea of Inner Earth as a place of powerful transformation and rebirth. This is in line with the Hopi's myth of their third world ancestors being reborn as the Hopi upon their exit from the subterranean realm. The Hopi are certainly not alone with these beliefs though. A truly surprising number of Native American tribes claim to have emerged from Inner Earth in a very similar way, including the Iroquois, the Navajo, the Zuni, the Mandan, the Pawnee, the Creeks, the Lakota, and quite a few more in Central and South America. To many tribes native to the southwest region of the US, the Grand Canyon is believed to be the location of the primary entrance to the underworld. More specifically, Hopi elders have described it as a physical portal housed in a large subterranean structure constructed by their original ancestors, the first people to leave Inner Earth. Interestingly, the Hopi claim to be the descendants of the Anasazi, a name which translates to Ancient Ones in Navajo. To this day, countless mysteries surround the civilization of the Anasazi. These ancient people were notable for their mastery of stone masonry, which they used to build towers aligned with solar and lunar events, as well as large subterranean temples known as kivas. These kivas strongly suggest that the Anasazi held a close and sacred connection to Inner Earth, because underground kivas were where they held their most important religious ceremonies. But perhaps the most impressive and relevant trait of these people was the bizarre fact that they built their homes into cliff and canyon walls. Across the southwest, the Anasazi constructed entire communities out of man-made caves, hundreds of feet high on sheer cliff faces using still unknown techniques. This obviously wasn't an easy or convenient thing to do, and the simplest answer is that it was a form of defense from enemies below, perhaps those below the canyon's crust, the people of the Third World that were sealed away. Regardless of these speculations, the historical fate of the Anasazi suggests their concerns may have been justified. Something terrible or otherwise exceptionally traumatic must have happened sometime in the 13th century, because the Anasazi seemingly fled their homes overnight, abandoning all that they built and disappeared completely. And nobody really knows why. The last Anasazi site within the larger Grand Canyon region is called Mummy Cave, just a short drive away from the national park. Dug into a protective alcove 300 feet above the canyon floor, this mesmerizing man-made community, fortress and tomb, was occupied for almost 1,000 years before suddenly being abandoned, like other Anasazi sites, in the 13th century AD. This site received the name Mummy Cave because 2 ancient bodies were found artificially mummified and entombed here during an early Smithsonian expedition. There are obvious parallels to Kincaid's cave, and even the Smithsonian was involved. But there are major differences too. The inside of Mummy Cave doesn't have a spoked hallway or tiered tombs, and no carved idol associated with any nearby tribe has ever come close to the cross-legged, lotus flower-holding Buddha that G.E. Kincaid reportedly discovered. But perhaps that's the very reason why Mummy Cave is well known, and why Kincaid's cave remains in the realm of inner Earth conspiracy theory. The narrative simply makes sense, but that won't stop seekers like us from continuing to dig. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode and haven't seen Inner Earth Conspiracy Theories number 5, that's a more extraterrestrial paranormal mystery from Eastern Europe, so definitely check it out. Or if you're in the mood to binge all my Inner Earth stories in one go, check out my curated playlist designed to transport you to the underground realm, linked in the description. Thank you to my patrons. Your support keeps me here in the surface world investigating mysteries, and if you'd like to join in, I've got links in the description to pledge monthly or make a one-time donation. 100% goes back into these videos. Lastly, check out Holzkern if you're looking for a special and unique gift for a loved one, or even yourself, and make sure to use my special link and promo code for that 15% discount and free wooden postcard. I'm Mr. Mythos. Never stop seeking. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.